Well, hello and
Welcome.
happy Thursday, everyone. Uh,
Episode 15.
Episode 15. I'm Johan. I work at the IT department of KTH.
My name is Patric, and I also work at the IT department. This is our podcast about digitalization, IT in general, and our general thoughts about stuff that is interesting.
Which is technology, always.
Which is technology, yeah.
And today we have two guests. Welcome. Really delighted that both of you could join us. Could you just say who you are and shortly introduce yourselves?
And you're muted, Dirk, so...
Yes, so maybe I can give it a start. So my name is Dirk. I'm since January 1st at KTH as a professor at CST as well as director of PDC. I'm originally coming from the area of computational science, more specifically simulation of strong interactions. We will talk later about, say, the relevance of high-performance computing, and this is an area where you need, say, high-performance computing systems. But then in some sense, I got more and more also fascinated by the technology, so I got involved in design of HPC systems. So that's why I moved more and more into the area of computer science and high-performance computing.
Very welcome to the pod. And you have also your colleague Gert with you.
Yes, I'm a long timer at PDC. So I was there when PDC started in 1990. So many years now and many supercomputers. So I'm a deputy director of PDC today, and of course very interested in technology as well.
And the reason why we invited you is because we saw it on the intranet that we have a new supercomputer coming, which is going to be ready sometime during the year, and we will need you to tell us a little bit about that. But if we start with the PDC, Parallel Datorcentrum at KTH. What is that, and why is this an important capacity for an institution like KTH?
Yeah, so PDC is one of several supercomputing centers at the Swedish level. So our mission is not limited to KTH, but it is actually, say, a national mission of providing researchers with access to computing resources. That means helping those scientists which really need large-scale simulations, and now in future more and more compute capabilities to do, for instance, machine learning for their research. Now, why is it important to have something like this at KTH? With high-performance computing, you really try to push performance to the limits, and we are always trying to be at the front of the technologies. And when we talk about later and on this new system, I mean, you will see, I mean, that is really, say, the newest technologies which you can get on the market. And for this, it is really important that you have these very close interaction with the computational scientists. And this is something which we can facilitate at KTH because we have so many very, very strong teams which are using HPC for their research.
And the center was started 30 years ago, more than 30 years ago then, Gert. How did things start?
Well, it started that KTH got a highly parallel system at that point, a supercomputer, which was one of the sort of first highly parallel machines in the world. It was called the connection machine. And parallel computing was a little bit on the new side at that point. Previously, supercomputers had been built by using very fast electronics, and but it was envisioned at that time that it was better to make supercomputers so you could have many components of the same type instead. So that was one of the first of that kind of computers.
And you're still around, and I guess you've seen it develop. we'll come to that, but I interrupted you, Patric, so go ahead.
No, I'm just wondering, because this is one of the areas I've been in software development all my career, but I know nothing about supercomputers. So I'm going to start with a basic question for anyone else that doesn't know it either. I've only met or seen a supercomputer once or twice. I've seen the Strindberg, which used to be in Noda, and I've seen the crane machines that they have in Linköping, which are basically sofas that you sit on in their coffee lounge nowadays. So what is a supercomputer in physical terms?
Yeah, supercomputer, I mean, is defined as the fastest computer you can build, especially for computational purposes. So what is a supercomputer sort of varies over time. What was a supercomputer in the past is not a supercomputer in today, of course.
Okay.
But the supercomputer is still a big thing. I mean, the supercomputer we have today is around 70 square meters and takes half a room of substantial size. It uses a lot of power and a lot of cooling. So, I mean, this is back to the old days of computing, more or less, where you have a full room of computing stuff.
So is supercomputing nowadays a software problem, or is it a physical problem with heating and sort of speed of light barriers to?
Well, this is some sense both, right? I mean, on the one hand, I mean, you want to say push the performance limits as far as possible, and there we could, in principle, go much further than as we are today. So in this sense, it's say the technologies are in principle there. However, there is one big problem, and that is that say parallel computers, because they are essentially composed of many computers, as we basically have them on our say desktop, but with our say laptops maybe consuming something in the order of depending on how you run it, in the order of 40 to 50 watt when it's connected to power, below the 10 watt when it's running on battery. I mean, if you have many thousands of them, then we are talking about megawatts of power consumption, and that is a real cost driver. So it's very clear in more and more in the future. I mean, the cost of a supercomputer will essentially be defined by your electricity bill. Yeah. And so the big challenge in terms of the technologies is how can we actually design these supercomputers more and more power efficient. And that is now becoming, say, a key driver. Now, to take, for instance, the example of the upcoming supercomputer at PDC, Dardel, the past or the still running current supercomputer, BESCO, is based on, say, standard CPUs. So in terms of the single nodes, it has, say, a lot of, say, similarity as you would use, say, a server in your department, or maybe in parts also your desktop. Okay. Now, these CPUs, they are not the most power efficient if you look at the metric of how much power is consumed per floating point operation, which is executed. Okay. And there are technologies which are much more efficient, and that are graphics processors. So now our upcoming system, actually, most of the computational performance will come from GPUs. Now, and that's where we then hit also, it's not the only reason, but it's one of the reasons where, of course, you hit then a software challenge, because the challenge is how can a scientist make efficient use of these graphics processors? And how can we do that? Well, at the same time, also say the applications which are running on these supercomputers is becoming more and more complex, because you try to address more complex problems in the area of physics, turbulent flows, chemistry, brain research, etc.
So how does the work actually? Do you do the supercomputing, or is it the research teams that sort of do all the programming to make the hypercomputing work, or you work as a team? Or just do you understand my question?
It is. I mean, as PDC, of course, our first responsibility is to make sure that we have these supercomputers and that they run stable and efficiently. But then our other work, and that's actually where I say by now a very significant part of our staff is involved, is to help the computational scientists to actually be able to use these supercomputers. And this will become a more and more important part of our work because the software challenges, given the growing complexity also of the underlying hardware, will become bigger. So that's where we have to work very closely then with the application developers, and we do have application experts at PDC who help the users with using the right compilers, using the best possible libraries. But we also have researchers which are really engaged in the research in order to push the frontiers in computational science.
So what sciences are pushing the computers nowadays? Is it weather, or is it military, or aerodynamics, or what areas are sort of in the edge?
I mean, as you say, weather or maybe more accurate climate research is a good example of an application which everyone understands is very important today. And of course also to understand the chemical reactions in the body, what is called molecular dynamics, is something which is very important today, because you like to understand how viruses in the body work, and a lot of how medicine can help to take away viruses or react with viruses and things like that. So, I mean, there are many applications which are, and we are not dealing anything with military applications. But as you say, also what is called CFD, computational fluid dynamics, is a very important and big area where you like to study the flow of something on a large scale, like an aeroplane, or building a new aeroplane which is more fuel efficient for the future might be an example which is easy to understand.
And maybe to highlight that, I mean, while PDC, like many other supercomputing centers, was initially focusing very much on, say, scientific applications, over time, also the work with industry partners became more and more important because industry does realize that they can save a lot of money by using numerical simulations. I mean, Gert already noticed, for instance, noted the designs in aerospace. So that was definitely one key driver also for use of HPC in the industrial context, but also in car industry. I mean, where having a very efficient aerodynamics is also very important, and where you can at parts also, for instance, replace crash tests by numerical tests, and in this way saving money. And that's why PDC is already working since quite some time quite closely with Scania. Actually, they are actually hosting part of our supercomputers are actually paid by Scania and used by them, and in this way we facilitate a very close collaboration between, say, scientific HPC and industrial HPC.
Interesting.
We got a question, and this is, then we're going from the big application area to very detailed. But what kind of GPUs are used in the upcoming supercomputer, and where can I buy one? This is from one of our devs.
Well, I mean, the GPU which will be installed this fall, or the GPU part of the system which will be installed this fall, is not released yet, but it is based on the AMD line of GPUs. So it's a new version of the AMD GPUs, which will be really new when we install it, maybe in November or something like that.
So is that a trend that you go more and more against the regular consumer, sort of semi-consumer?
That has been the trend for a long time, that we are using more and more standard components. Maybe not the full standard components, but on the GPU side, I would say they are really standard. On the CPU side, we might have a little more cores on the chip than what you have on the normal laptop. but it's basically the same stuff, but we have many more of what you have in your laptop.
Yeah.
So we are talking about many thousands or 10,000s of cores in our systems, right?
So,
and also for the graphics card, I think it's important to realize that we really use here high-end graphics cards. So that is say something where if you would buy them on the regular market, I mean, you could easily pay a few $1,000s for a single for one of these cards. But one thing which is of course a challenge for us is HPC. I mean, even so we have very big systems, it remains in the global market, it remains a kind of a niche market. And this is a challenge because the technologies which we are using, they are extremely expensive to develop. So, I mean, companies like NVIDIA, which were, say, long time dominating the market of graphics card also for high performance computing, claims that they're putting a new generation of graphics card on the market cost them about $1 billion. And that means you have to service a market which is, say, giving you a revenue of many billions of dollars just in order to be able, I mean, to refund these non-recurring engineering costs. And is actually where the key reason why we have to try to be very close to a commodity market. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that this is a standard consumer market in the sense of, for instance, taking the graphics card, that this is a graphics card which you will typically find in, say, a desktop at home. Certainly not. But it is nevertheless a product which is used in a much wider market. And we are, say, in this sense, quite lucky that graphics cards are very interesting for machine learning. So you have very, very big data centers which are much larger than our HPC centers, which use these graphics cards for machine learning. And in this way, you have these very big market where we can benefit then from when talking about high performance computing.
Cool. And the computers are named after Swedish writers normally, right?
Yeah, that started with the connection machine, which was CM. So we called the first machine CM Bellman after connection machine Bellman. And then we have used sort of author names for all our machines.
And the latest one is Dardell. Could you just give us a few figures, us nerds? The new supercomputer, how many cores? Can you give us some ideas of what we're talking about here? You said many, and yes.
So we are talking about 70,000 cores in the first phase here, and the power consumption about 300 to 400 kilowatt. So it's a big piece, and this machine will be water cooled. So it will continue with the water cooling we have on the current machine, but it will be directly water cooled. So water goes directly to the circuits on the boards. And that is also used to heat the KTH campus in the winter. So a pretty big fraction of the heat in the winter at KTH is coming from our systems.
Super smart. So where will this place the KTH instance in relation to other supercomputers around the world?
Yeah, on a Swedish scale, we are probably the fastest when we are done, but on the international scale, we are not so big. Maybe on the 50th place or something like that. I mean, there are many bigger machines in the world which are 100 times bigger than our machine. So,
yeah, maybe we should explain to the audience at this point that there is one way of, say, comparing supercomputers, which, say, has become essentially the standard, and that is you compare the systems by the throughput of floating point operations while performing one particular benchmark, which is called the high performance LIMPAC benchmark. Okay. And then you get essentially, say, a number in terms of floating point operations per second. And then you can start to rank these different systems. And this kind of ranking is happening 2 times per year and the outcome is a so-called top 500 list, which is published typically in June and November. One is doing a conference in Germany, and the other one is doing a conference in the US. Now, well, this has been, say, a kind of an established metrics. I mean, one has to also be a bit cautious with these kind of figures, because it is measured while executing a very specific benchmark. And it's also, say, a benchmark where this technology is particularly shiny, because you can really push the performance to the limit. So it's a little bit like looking at it as a race car. Now, this is not necessarily the way of how the scientists are using it in practice. So that's why we have to be careful. On the one hand, of course, it's important to be high up in this list in order to be visible internationally.
So this is
but at the end, we have not to forget the most important thing is these are tools to produce science results, right? Exactly. So at the end, we have to look of how much science is actually produced with these kind of systems. And then the ranking could, at the end, also be quite different.
Yeah, it's important to remember. We got a few more questions here, and you answer them if you can. The first one, what does a modern supercomputer cost? What is the approximate cost of Dardell?
So we're talking about 100 million kroner in investment.
So like 10 million euros, something like that as an investment. Yeah. And then a question that is very specific. Maybe you're under NDA, but since you mentioned AMD, are we talking RDNA 3?
No.
I mean, we are talking. I mean, this one can say in public. We are talking about upcoming AMD GPUs, so they are not existing on the market. They will go under the name of MI200. And these are actually also the same GPUs which will, by the way, be used for, which is probably going to be the first exascale system in the US that is being installed at the Oak Ridge National Lab in the US. So we also hope in this way that we can benefit from, say, the strong push which is now happening in different communities. Also in Europe, the same technology will, for instance, used for one of the pre-exascale systems, which is currently being, say, the installation is prepared in Finland. So we will, say, try to benefit then also for the many efforts which are, say, performed at an international level to facilitate the use of this very high performant and brand new technology for computational science.
Cool. Good clarification, and also it puts things in, for me, in a lot more context, because now you demystified what this is. You also, I mean, I understand the components. I do not understand the applications because I'm not a scientist with that type of calculation need, but I understand that this is very important, but it also, the value of this investment comes when it meets the application in science, and this is why it's super relevant and super important for KTH to do this. Where do you see that this is going? I mean, obviously we always will need computing power, but are there new areas of application that you see on the horizon? Who will utilize this type of facility in 5 years from now? Where do you think this is going? Will it just be more of the same type of calculations, or are there new areas that you think in the future will benefit from this? This is just a speculation, of course.
The new area here is the machine learning stuff, right? We talked about. So in the future or in a number of years, this kind of machine learning will be in everyone's computers. And it's already there to some extent today. So machine learning is the new thing for using high-performance computers as well, supercomputers. But otherwise, I mean, it will probably be more of also the old traditional simulation stuff. The demands are enormous on some of the applications that we mentioned.
I mean, there are some areas which you had already mentioned, which are actually relatively new areas in the area of life sciences and medicine. So if one looks, for instance, in the research on cancer, where in particular also, say, machine learning techniques are more and more used, if one looks into the area of personalized medicine, I mean, where you want to basically, based on individual patient data, try to simulate models and get results in a very short period of time. I mean, this is certainly our new areas where people are working on, but they are not yet, say, to a point where we can really use that, say, where we see this being used at a daily basis, and where we expect that much more, say, computing power is being used. And we also, say, starting to reach out to new areas where, say, also research is done at KTH. So if we, for instance, look into the area of, like, for instance, energy research, I mean, a lot of these development when it comes to towards the work towards a carbon-free economy, there are a lot of problems which involve, say, a lot of engineering problems in where HPC can play a role. And even if it comes to, say, urban development, and try to understand of how can we, say, change our the way of how the urban structures are organized, how buildings are being designed. There are, say, use cases where HPC can play a role, and we see that this is going to play more and more a role. And there's one very important keyword which is going to play an important role in the future, and this is the keyword is called digital twins. So one very new development is that you try, and that has applications in many areas, you try to have a model of something else, and something else could be starting from a windmill, but it could also be, say, a complete city, and then you connect these models with sensor data, which you get then through IoT devices. So you see suddenly that you have completely different areas of computing, which then starts to get together. Say, on the one hand, HPC computing, where you have then models which could, for instance, analyze or predict of how pollution is evolving. And on the other hand, you have data which coming from sensors, for instance, attached to buses driving through the city. And one of the interesting challenges is how do we get these data together? Because that is not something which we had been used to in the past.
And this concept was called digital.
Well, there is the concept of digital twins. So
digital
basically,
twins. Yeah.
You have something which is in the reality that could be, say, a factory, it could be a windmill, it could be a transformator, and you try to model that, and based on that, you basically try to learn on how is something going to behave. Can I, for instance, predict that I need a maintenance, right? And then, since this is a model, you have to also couple it to, say, the reality.
Yeah.
And so that's why you start. So the twin is basically you have the virtual model, and you have the real incarnation, and both of them are a twin.
Really fascinating, and of course
that's a podcast episode in itself.
Yeah, and the complexity of this is, as complex as the world. So basically, there is no limit to the computing capabilities or power needed in order to facilitate that. It's just a matter of how finely grained this twin should be. So, very interesting.
Yeah, and it is for us also, say, a question of how do we transform our data centers, right? Because, I mean, so far we are used to confine the supercomputer because it is something which you want to protect. It is a dual use facility, and you don't want people to abuse it for instance, military purposes. So in high performance computing, we are used to operating these high performance computers in a very confined area. And now we start to see workflows which extend far beyond the data center. And then we are still starting to understand of how do we actually facilitate these workflows, which are not only, say, inside our supercomputer center, but which, say, extends beyond that.
We have one final question from the library. For instance, in the area of medicine, do you see an increasing demand for legal agreements being signed before scientists can send data to HPC, i.e. data from patients and/or personal devices? Is this something you come across, or is this something that is handled elsewhere?
Oh yes, we come across that, and that is, say, another area where we have to work on is how can we, say, facilitate the processing of personal data on systems like the upcoming Dardell. So this is something which is not not trivial. I mean, there are, of course, say concerns about security because it is personal data, and we have to look at all the risks which could be associated to then, even if you try to anonymize or pseudonymize this data, there remains a risk of being able to re-identify the data subject to which this data belongs to. So, and here we have to look in what are, say, the right technical solutions for that. But of course, there's also, say, we have to adhere to a legal framework derived from the GDPR, and there are, say, then also, say, contractual issues which need to be addressed because at the end it's also about defining who is responsible for what. To protect ourselves also against, say, any situation which we don't want to happen, any that data is leaking and possibly allows them to re-identify a data subject, because nobody wants to see, say, his patient, his health data and then appearing somewhere else. So it's very important that we, say, have a very well-defined and well-protected trust relation there.
So time is running out. I just want to have one last question. So if you're anyone listening as a researcher, want to get in touch with you to get help with using HPC, how do they go about?
The first step is to contact us, of course, in some form, and we can provide some help for people to start with the HPC. But also, I mean, you also need to understand that it's not that easy task in many situations. I mean, many of the application we are talking about here has been developed maybe for 20, 30 years by a large group of scientists. So I don't like to discourage anyone from coming to us, but there is to really use those kind of machines, you need a lot of planning and programming, and so it's not just to sort of snap with the fingers and it's done.
That's good information as well.
Yeah, definitely.
So I mean, programming this machine has been a scientific problem for a long time, and people have worked with that many years. And will continue to work because the machines are changing. They're becoming more and more parallel in the future. And that is a sort of a development that probably will continue. So to utilize that big parallelism, you probably need even more advanced algorithms in your software.
Mm-hmm.
But you do not necessarily have to develop your application from scratch. I mean, there are more and more applications, very powerful applications, which are developed open source and which are available on systems like Dardell and this and say ready to use. Still, it may require adjustments for your specific need if you have, say, a very specific research problem. But I mean, I would also like to emphasize what Gert was saying. Please contact us. I mean, don't be discouraged and believe, oh, this is, say, a complex system I will never be able to use. Don't think about it in this way. It's better to get in contact with us, and then we can, say, discuss it and see maybe there are opportunities to use what is already, say, available and to connect to the work which has been, say, performed in over many decades.
Yeah,
very cool.
That's one of the good things about having you on KTH, that we're all colleagues. We can help each other.
Definitely.
Exactly.
And thank you so much, both of you, for joining, and welcome to KTH, Dirk. You're pretty new, at least. So warmly welcome to the Royal Institute of Technology. I hope you will enjoy it.
Thank you. I'm sure of that.
And we wish you all, and also you who listened live or afterwards, we wish you all a great continuation of this actually very nice spring day in Stockholm.
Yeah. Take care.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.